Hello, this is Paul Glumaz. I'm a 40-year veteran activist with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. Prior to my involvement with the Political Action Committee, and I've been involved in the Puget Sound area for 33 years. Prior to my involvement, I studied anthropology at Columbia University. And over the years, I've been thinking extensively about the problem of anthropology being essentially that it, in terms of the origin of man on this earth and in terms of the origins of civilization, anthropology does not really recognize that human beings are human. And so when they look at the issue of the evolution of man's coming into being as a species from an evolutionary standpoint, they tend to look at the genetic similarities with apes, and they tend to look at the fossil from that standpoint, and they tend to look at the emergence of technology, at the emergence of culture in a similar way, as a kind of gradual process which occurs and which is going on, and it continues to go on. They tend to see themselves as products rather than as creative actors. They tend to see themselves as determined rather than willful creative actors. And when people say that we are created in the image of the Creator, or some other concept which means that we are willful and creative actors, and that we have the power to create, which is what the idea of the man in the image of the Creator is. This is just rubbish. This is just superstition. This is just religion. This is just an opinion. This is just people, who believe in God and what have you. Well, I'm not here to discuss religion. I'm not here to talk about religion. I'm here to talk about creating a new anthropology based upon the distinction between what a human being is and what an animal is. And so, what I develop is a concept as a starting point, and I base this on the work of Nicholas of Cusa, who looked at science and looked at the universe from the standpoint of a maximum and a minimum. And I also looked at Schiller, the poet of human development in the classical German period. And in his poem, The Artist, he actually describes in there the actual cultural evolutionary process in the best way possible about human beings. And that is that human beings have a quality of being able to perceive proportions, to perceive beauty. And also, I'll get into that in a second. But so the first thing is, what is the minimum on which the human species, on which you can have a human consciousness? What is the minimum that you can have a human consciousness? And that minimum is not a biological thing. It's a social thing. And there's something outside of the social process, but it's a social process and something outside the social process that allows for a socialization of concepts which animals do not have. The most important concept is the concept of the one. And the concept of the one is the basis for naming of objects. But the concept of the one is also the basis for being able to have the many. And this concept of the one is the essence of the kind of concepts that human beings have and share in a social process, without which they could not exist, without which you could not have consciousness, social consciousness, or human consciousness as we know it. And that social one, that concept of the one, is one of the key concepts on which human existence occurs within the group, because you have to have a sense that the group is a one, and you have to have a sense that you're a member of that group for survival to occur. You also have to have a sense that the concepts that create the social structure, that create the basis for consciousness, are not concepts which are derived from sense experience. They're not concepts which are derived from interacting with nature in and of itself. They're not concepts based on a utilitarian, how do we poke a stick in the right place, how do we sharpen a stick, how do we make an arrow, or make a cutting tool. Those concepts are necessary for the existence of human consciousness, which is necessary for the existence of human beings in society, which is necessary for the existence of the capability to do those sort of things. But just the knowledge, just having some imitation of somebody else's procedure that was witnessed and done, is not the same thing. It's animals probably could, apes could probably be trained to do some of these things. So this question of the minimum is what I'm going to explore a little bit here, and go into then looking at some of the key issues in anthropology from the standpoint of the minimum. So this minimum that I'm talking about is the minimum for the existence of human consciousness. Now, there is a social minimum that exists, and there's also a cultural minimum for the social minimum to exist. And don't animals have intelligence? Don't apes have intelligence? Apes, wolves, elephants, dolphins, even bees. I mean, aren't they coordinated? Don't they have a kind of society? Don't they have a kind of intelligence? And they do. But human intelligence is not the same as animal intelligence, because human intelligence operates in a world of concepts which are beyond sense experience. And this is not a behavioral issue of learning to do this or learning to do that or learning to copy this or learning to copy that, but they live in a different space mentally of concepts which are socially created. They're socially socialized. But without those concepts, you couldn't exist. And those concepts are of the type of the one, a concept of origin, a concept of the unseen or spirits. Those are the kind of concepts that exist, that have to exist for the society to exist. Because to the mind, to the human consciousness, the sensory world is incomprehensible. And the human being is driven by a desire for comprehension. And why is the human being driven for a comprehension is the fact that the human being, in the social sense, exists in a different space. It's a moral space in the broadest sense of the word. It's a space of concepts of the type I'm talking about. And it's a space of where the human being has this quality of a concreated power of judgment, which is what Nicholas of Cusa lays out. That is the power to judge, the power to discern proportions, the power to have a sense of justice, the power to have a sense of beauty. And human being, the socialization of that power and the products of the effort to make comprehensible the incomprehensible physical reality, or the physical senses, what you experience through the senses, is that desire, that drive to make those things comprehensible is the essence of what distinguishes man from the animals. That's a different quality. It doesn't mean animals don't have intelligence. It doesn't mean that animals don't communicate with each other. But animals don't have this quality. And this quality is the essence of human cognition, beyond which a minimum if society collapses. Okay, now we come into the cultural question. In order for a society to exist, the society has to cooperate. The people in the society, there's no such thing as struggle of survival of the fittest. The human beings cooperate with each other. And existing in society means cooperation. It means sharing a certain concepts. But those concepts are created by individuals in the society. And those individuals are the leaders. And those individuals also create the identities on which the individuals in that society function, in that grouping function. And a culture is the actual product of all this entire process. Now, that culture has to develop greater power because there's a certain conflict between the identities one gets in the culture and one's perception of the incompleteness of those identities. So there's a certain desire for comprehension which is driving the whole process. And Schiller describes this in his poem, The Artist, best of all. And where the beauty in nature is provoking mankind to formulate, to create an imitation, which is that creating that imitation of beauty actually transforms man into a creative being. But the creation of an imitation of the beauty of nature is this attempt is not only an attempt for comprehension, but it's an attempt to create for man this this beauty. Now, at the same time, you have in the culture, you have a need for it to develop, because otherwise, if the culture becomes too fixed, then the society collapses because the individual is stifled, and the stifling of the individual in the culture leads to the collapse of the fixedness of a culture cannot survive. The society can't survive, and the culture has to be developing. Now, this brings up the issue of language and the origin of language, and this is the biggest issue in anthropology. But from the standpoint of the minimum cognition that is required for the sustaining of the society, for the sustaining of the culture, the development of the culture to sustain the society, to sustain the cognition in the society, which is in this concreated power of judgment perspective, wherein the concepts of the one, the concepts of origin, the concepts of explaining the unseen, which is used to explain the visible, which is incomprehensible, the development of that and the development of that is the essence of the development of language. Now, the origin of language is neither all of a sudden language emerged, or all of a sudden it was created through sounds or what have you, because human beings had to be human before they create language. Or, put it another way, language can be created before they are human, but it's not human language. I'm not, that's kind of unclear what I'm saying, but in other words, human beings create language. Grammarians and linguists don't create language. Human beings create language. And human beings are constantly creating language. Whether it's language by signs or whether it's language by sounds or whatever. Because they're trying to communicate concepts, which paradoxically cannot be communicated in the language. So the language is used as a mnemonic attempt to trigger a concept that exists in the mind of one individual, that is being triggered, that pre-exists in the mind of another individual. But the language is used to do that, but the language itself cannot communicate the concept. So the development of language is driven by the desire for comprehension, the desire to communicate concepts, and the desire to communicate discoveries. And it's human beings are creative, therefore they create language. The language does not create the human being. Human beings create the language. And through the language, they're able to develop mnemonic platforms for the concepts that are necessary that are to be shared, on which the society's existence depends. This is a very radical conception in anthropology. I don't know of anybody who's ever presented this before in this way, and perhaps I have not presented it in the most perfect way. I've written a paper on it, which is probably a better presentation than what I'm giving you right now. But the idea is that we're human, and an example of what a human being is the discovery that even Neanderthals had grave sites, and the Neanderthals and others had grave sites, and what a grave site and the art associated with the grave site represents is the fact that the individuals of that society or that group had a sense that there was something different about humanity, about themselves, about each other, that transcended the actual physical sense certainty, that there was something about a person that was not governed by biology or governed by, and that they were essentially representing that in the burial process, that they were actually representing or reifying that for the society themselves, that there was something outside the bounds of sense perception, outside the bounds of biology, outside the bounds outside the bounds. So essentially, this is an example of a perception of humans about the nature, their nature, which is not animal. Now, the other corresponding fact is that if a culture is stifling the creative process, the culture has to collapse. Because a population is expanding, there has to be creative breakthroughs in order to change the relationship that human beings have with the environment in order to continue to have human beings exist. So human beings are recreating themselves through creating and recreating culture. And when they are unable to do so, that's when the society collapses. No human beings can exist as animals. A lot of anthropologists and early explorers, when they came upon pre-agricultural societies, they thought these agricultural societies were very pristine because they didn't have the greed principle in them. People were very well behaved. And a lot of people thought that this primitive condition was the natural condition of man. But actually what they did not take into account is the dynamic of leadership that exists in every human society. No matter how primitive, there is leadership. And without leadership, those societies cannot exist. And the leader is not the strongest guy that goes out and is the best hunter. It's usually often the weakest person, or often a woman, who is the leader, spiritual leader. And what does a spiritual leader do? It creates the concepts, it creates the ideas, it creates the stories, it transmits the stories of origin, the cosmology that is created to explain the unexplainable, which is the physical sensations. And that the physical, incomprehensible, empirical reality that cannot be comprehended. So human beings create an approximation of some causality behind that, and that's in the form of discussing the unseen, or what might be shaping the visible universe. Animals don't do that. Animals aren't trying to figure out why this is happening or that's happening, or what's causing this to happen, or what's causing that. Animals don't do that. Human beings do that, and that's the nature of humanity from the very beginning. And these individuals, some people would call them shamans, and it's the shaman who's responsible for the psychological condition of the group, because in a group of that nature, existence is not a given. And if you have one person who's not functioning in a cooperative way, it's very disruptive. And therefore, the shaman has to deal with that person, or the leadership has to deal with that person for the group. And therefore, people are well behaved, because any greed instinct, any ego that interferes with the development or function of the group has to be dealt with. And it is dealt with in the form of, well, you have an evil spirit that's disrupting the group. You have to get rid of that evil spirit, or you have to leave the group and die. Because outside the group, you can't survive. So all these ideas of struggle of the survival of the fittest, all these ideas are total garbage. Human existence only occurs in the most extreme form of cooperation, but that cooperation cannot cause a fixed culture to set in to cause the restriction on the creative potential of the individuals, because that creative potential of the individual making creative contributions has to exist in the culture for the culture to survive over time. So these are the things that a new anthropology has to look at. So when you find archaeological artifacts, or you find bones, or you find whatever, you can look at the bones from a genetic and compare them to the, like they compared various different bones with different genetic, how close they were genetically and all of that. But that doesn't tell you what a human being is. It doesn't define what a human being is and how human beings actually exist as humans and how they actually develop from the minimum to develop the capacity to continue developing. None of that is explained in existing anthropology. Okay? And there is this distinction. And if you start from that distinction, then the issue of the origin of language is not so big a deal, because it's not language that created man, it's man who created language. And man, had to be human, had to have a human capability in order for language to be created. But that doesn't necessarily mean that humans had a full development of the larynx and everything like that before they were human. It just means that the process of creating a language was driven by the desire for comprehension. And animals have language. Animals have all kinds of languages to communicate. They can communicate emotions. They can communicate all kinds of things. But human beings are not functioning in an animal language orientation. Although they could. At times people do. But human beings can have animal-like communications, but they have something else, which is a human communication of concepts. And that kind of communication does not exist between animals. And the confusion that exists in the field of biology and the field of anthropology is there's no distinction on this. There is none. And this is big. This is huge, because people walk around thinking they're animals. They deny their humanity. It's implicit in the culture. It's implicit when you get an education in the schools. It's implicit when you study biology. It's implicit when you study sociology. It's implicit when you study anthropology. That you're nothing more than an animal, a complicated animal, governed by instincts, governed by premeditated genetics or whatever. And you're not. You're a human being. And you have that capacity of concreated power of judgment that can reflect upon your nature, that can reflect upon unseen spirits, that can that upon the fact that you're there's a one, you're part of a one. You're not just you. You're not just it. But that's a concept. That's not, you're in a wolf pack, right? It's not the same thing. And we, as human beings, are being treated very improperly, and a great disservice is being done to us by the disciplines of biology and anthropology today. And we need to change that. We need to have a concept of man, which is based upon our distinction from animals, rather than one that is just an elaboration or of a more complex animal. And that's what the new anthropology is about. Once you do that, then you're going to look at things differently. You're going to study archaeological digs differently. You're going to interpret what you discover archaeologically different. You're going to look at what the culture was that created this. And the biggest thing is the issue of fire. What was the culture that created in man the lessening of fear such that fire could be played with? Because what does culture do? What does art do? What does art do? It creates a capacity to what? To control what? Your internal self. This conceptual aspect, as it's developed by culture, allows you to control your internal forces of nature, your will, your internal forces of nature, as well as the external forces, to change the external forces around you. So the invention of fire had to be preceded by a certain level of cultural development. And it was the cultural development that is the essence of the evolution. And it's art, which is the essence of cultural development. And the invention of fire, or the discovery of fire and the use of fire, was the most profound revolutionary breakthrough in man's relationship to nature. But it had to be preceded by a process of artistic development before that could happen. Because it's through artistry that human beings establish a mastery of their own fear and animal-like qualities. They essentially can temper those and not be controlled by them, because you're no longer in an animal. You're a human being. You're outside the control of fear. You're outside the control of greed. You're outside the control of hunger. You're no longer being determined by those things, and therefore you have a capacity to then examine and control not only yourself, but increasingly control the forces of nature outside of you, and that can't be done by animals. And it's not just a morphological issue. The morphology of man has followed the development of man's consciousness, but this quality is very different. And when human cultures and human societies collapse below the minimum, and they no longer maintain the minimum in their society, as is the case here, we're no longer maintaining the minimum cultural level and social level to be able to maintain cognitive human beings, then the whole society collapses. And I could say a lot more, but I'll leave it at that. And with the Political Action Committee, and I've been involved in the Puget Sound area for 33 years. Prior to my involvement, I studied anthropology at Columbia University. And over the years, I've been thinking extensively about the problem of anthropology being essentially that it, in terms of the origin of man on this earth and in terms of the origins of civilization, anthropology does not really recognize that human beings are human. And so when they look at the issue of the evolution of man's coming into being as a species from an evolutionary standpoint, they tend to look at the genetic similarities with apes, and they tend to look at the fossil from that standpoint, and they tend to look at the emergence of technology, at the emergence of culture in a similar way, as a kind of Hello, this is Paul Glumaz. I'm a 40-year veteran activist with the LaRouche Political Action Committee. Prior to my involvement, which is what the idea of the man in the image of the Creator is, this is just rubbish. This is just superstition. This is just religion. This is just an opinion. This is just people, who believe in God and what have you. Well, I'm not here to discuss religion. I'm not here to talk about religion. I'm here to talk about creating a new anthropology based upon the distinction between what a human being is and what an animal is. And it's a gradual process which occurs and which is going on, and it continues to go on. They tend to see themselves as products rather than as creative actors. They tend to see themselves as determined rather than willful creative actors. And when people say that we are created in the image of the Creator or some other concept, which means that we are willful and creative actors, and that we have the power to create,